Hello, my name is Tyler Blackburn, and this is my final project for Black Studies 219, Introduction to African Studies. And today I will be telling you a little bit about the Ethiopian Empire. So when I got this project, I definitely knew that it would be between two different empires, that of Egypt, which I've always found fascinating since I was a young child, but also Ethiopia. Given Ethiopia's importance to civilization, I really thought that was the correct choice for me. So, with that said, Ethiopia is one of the oldest and original civilizations in the world. Um, its story stretches back thousands of years and stands out not only for the age of the empire and its long running monarchies and empire as a whole, but also what it contributed to modern civilization, culture, and then what it kind of means for African and black people around the world. It has rich culture that runs deep, numerous religious traditions, mostly known for its Christianity, and especially the ability that it had to remain independent, as it was the only African country on the continent that was not colonized. With that said, kind of to go through its history briefly, what we now call Ethiopia was actually inhabited by many different areas to this day, because we know Ethiopia to be exclusively African today. But it consisted of the Sudan, parts of Egypt, Arabia, Palestine, Western Asia, and even India. Um, and they've gone by a few different names, including Kushites and things like that. But it has mostly been considered one of the most powerful empires throughout African history. One of its earliest kingdoms was called Demet, which existed around the 10th century BCE in the northern highlands. Although there's still a lot, that we don't know about Demet being so old, it's clear that it laid a powerful foundation for the civilization of Ethiopia that followed. So one of the civilizations was the kingdom of Axum, which rose to power in roughly the first century CE. Axum was not just a regional power, but in the ancient world, it was one of the greatest empires on earth, mentioned alongside places like Rome, Persia, China, things like that. The Axumites developed their own written language called Ge'ez, minted their own coins, and traded goods like gold and ivory with places, as far away as like India or across the Mediterranean Sea. And such of their monuments were large obelisks called stelae that actually still stand today, even though that they're thousands of years old. A major turning point for the Axum Empire, though, or the Axumites, as far as the Ethiopia Empire, came in the 4th century when King Ezana converted the empire to Christianity. And this is really important, as it was one of the first countries in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion, long before most of Europe even did. Christianity didn't just become a religion in Ethiopia, it was also a foundation for their government, their culture, and national identity. And to this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church remains central to the country's traditions. It's important to note that a lot of places point to, Ethiopia as the cradle of humanity. The oldest version of the Bible was found there, so on and so forth. So it's very important to Christianity. By the 13th century, a ruling family came to power, one that would last more than 700 years, and this was the Solomonic dynasty, beginning with Emperor Yekuno Amlak in around 1217. He claimed to be a direct descendant of King Solomon of Israel, but also the Queen of Sheba, which was central to Ethiopian royal history, as they once again tied Christianity closely to this. Whether or not it was literally true, this connection, gave the Ethiopian rulers a powerful symbolic link to biblical history. And then under the Solomonic empires, Ethiopia became a strong and complex governmental state. It was Christian, but multi-ethnic, multilingual, so a lot was going on there. The emperor often had to balance power among different regions and religious groups, including, Christians, Muslims, which still very prominent there today, Jewish people, amongst other things. He also had a mix of both highland and lowland territories, and the rulers worked constantly to hold the empire together. This was done through religious authority, once again being tied closer to Christianity, regional alliances, as they used to be made up of a bunch of different areas, and then military campaigns. One of the major threats that came was in the 16th century when the Muslim leader Ahmad Ibrahim al-Ghazi led an invasion into the neighboring Adal Sultanate. His armies came close to destroying the empire. In response, Ethiopia called on Portugal for military support. The Portuguese sent soldiers and weapons, and together with Ethiopia, they eventually defeated Ahmad's army. This event was key example of Ethiopia's strategy throughout history, where it formed alliances when necessary, but remained independent as a whole, which is, once again, very key that it was the only country in Africa that was not colonized. And then again, during the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a time of both cultural achievement and political decentralization. The empire did survive, but power became more spread out amongst local leaders, which included local religious figures, but also warlords. And this period is sometimes called the era of princes. It did see internal conflict, but it was also a time of growth for things like their architecture, religious life once again, and then literature, arts, things like that. In the 19th century, Ethiopia again faced growing threats from outside, especially from European colonial powers, as did much of Africa, especially the 18th century, 17th century, the slave trade, things like that. So as the European nations scrambled to colonize Africa, Ethiopia stood in the way of all of the powers. One of the most defining moments in its modern history was the Battle of Adwa, and that happened in 1896. Under Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopian forces were able to defeat the Italian army, which had attempted to turn Ethiopia into an Italian colony. The victory at Adwa was not just a military success, but it was also a major political and cultural event as well. It shocked Europe. Not many of the colonizing forces were kept out, and also inspired other African nations to fight back against colonization, to where Ethiopia became a long-lasting symbol of anti-colonial resistance, which is why it's kind of seen as this symbol of freedom for all African people across the world. And it provoked, and it proved that African countries could stand up to European powers and win in some cases. Then in the early 20th century, the Ethiopian Empire began to modernize. So they built roads, schools, and they tried to centralize the government and its power a little bit more. These changes were made by Emperor Haile Selassie I, who ruled from roughly 1930 to 1974. Haile Selassie is one of the most famous figures in modern African history, but obviously Ethiopia as well. He was a symbol of African unity and independence, and then helped found the Organization of African Unity based in Addis Ababa, which is Ethiopia's capital. Ethiopia's independence, though, was again tested in the 1930s when fascist Italy, again under Mussolini this time, invaded the country. And despite its resistance, Ethiopia was occupied for about 5 years, but never fully colonized. Haile Selassie went into exile, but, he gave a powerful speech at the League of Nations and asked for help. And then eventually the British joined forces with Ethiopia and returned Selassie to power. So once again, Ethiopia was able to fight back and reclaim its freedom, acting as this signal for all of Africa. Selassie, though, faced a lot of serious challenges, and there were growing demands for political reform, redistribution of land, and democracy within Ethiopia. And then in 1974, there was a period of following a period of famine and protests, military unrest. Marxist groups known as the Derg overthrew the emperor, and this marked the end of the Ethiopian Empire, which lasted for the better part of 3,000 years, one of the longest in the world. So the Derg abolished the monarchy and established a socialist regime, which soon became one of the most repressive in African history. So the civil war, human rights abuses, and famine followed that. And then in the 90s, the Derg itself fell, and Ethiopia moved towards a more federal democratic system that we still see today. So even though the empire no longer exists as a political system, its influence can be seen everywhere in modern Ethiopia. This includes, like I mentioned earlier, with Christianity being tied so closely in it, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Ge'ez script, because that keeps being passed down through their literature. The stories of Queen Sheba and the memory of Adwa are still central to the Ethiopian identity. So you can still see how the empire influences it. It is still the only African empire country that was never permanently colonized. And that gives their people a deep sense of pride. But once again, it acts as a beacon for our most Black or African people across the world. More broadly, the Ethiopian Empire challenged, many assumptions people made about Africa. It showed us that African civilizations were not disconnected or passive. They were very active, creative, and then deeply involved in shaping not only Africa, but the world as a whole, and how we think about things, do things, how we develop civilization, the economy, religion, things like that. Its long-lasting history of Christianity and state building and resistance reminds us that African history is not just about colonization, but also about leadership. It's complex, it endures, it's strong, and it's brave. So yeah, I mean, there's so much more we could say about Ethiopia and dive into its rich history, how it gives us a lot of modern things, including coffee. Coffee is one of my favorite things, which when I went to Ethiopia, I definitely indulged in. Being a Christian myself, I indulged in that while I was there too, and it's fascinating to see the origins tied to Ethiopia, but possibly all peoples as a whole. So yeah, that's mostly why I decided to choose the Empire of Ethiopia, amongst also its bravery and ability to never be colonized by European powers. So, with that said, thank you very much, and that was my final for Black Studies 200. Bye bye.